My name is Rowan Kincaid, and for 22 years, I have been the silent guardian of steel and concrete in a city that is constantly trying to tear itself apart with wind. They call me a lead structural engineer, but in reality, I am a translator. I translate the groans of settling foundations, the screech of metal fatigue, and the whisper of microfractures into warnings that keep people alive. At 45, I have learned that buildings are not static objects. They are living, breathing entities that constantly fight against gravity. And on that gray Tuesday in late October, the Iron Foundry, a massive, century-old industrial beast we were converting into the Thorn Legacy Plaza, was losing that fight. I wasn't looking at a computer screen when I realized it. I was sitting in my temporary office on the second floor, surrounded by blueprints, when I felt it in my teeth. It was a low-frequency vibration, a hum that traveled up through the floorboards, through the legs of my chair, and settled in the base of my skull. It was the specific, terrifying frequency of a structure that has lost its stiffness. On my desk, a ceramic mug of lukewarm tea confirmed my fear. The liquid wasn't just shaking, it was forming perfect, standing waves. That pattern meant only one thing: harmonic resonance. The building was beginning to dance to the rhythm of the wind outside, and we weren't even at full height yet. I grabbed the latest sensor readouts, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the tablet, and marched toward the glass-walled conference room where the future of this project was being decided. The contrast between the construction zone and the executive suite was jarring. I stepped from a world of dust, sparks, and the smell of welding ozone into a hermetically sealed bubble of lavender scent and air conditioning. Inside, Julian Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Development, stood at the head of a mahogany table. Julian was a man who had inherited an empire and was currently busy gambling it away on this one legacy project. He wore a suit that cost more than my foreman made in a year, but it couldn't hide the sweat glistening on his upper lip. He was under immense pressure from the banks, and pressure makes men like Julian do stupid things. Sitting to his right was the source of my headache: Sienna Thorne, his 24-year-old niece, and the newly appointed creative visionary. She was everything I was not: polished, trendy, and completely unburdened by the laws of physics. She was sketching on an iPad, looking bored, as if the structural integrity of a 40-story building was just a matter of choosing the right color palette. I didn't knock. I walked in and placed my tablet directly on the polished table, the plastic clicking sharply against the wood. Julian stopped mid-sentence, his smile faltering. I didn't give him time to recover. I pointed to the graph on my screen, where a red line was spiking dangerously upward. I spoke clearly, keeping my voice low, the voice of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. I told them that the vibration sensors on the primary trusses were screaming. I explained that the removal of the interior load-bearing walls on the lower levels to create the grand lobby had reduced our shear strength by 30%. I told them, unequivocally, that we needed to halt the installation of the Italian marble flooring on the upper decks immediately. The old steel frame was already flexing too much. Adding 500 tons of stone to the top floors without reinforcing the base was suicide. It was like putting a heavy backpack on a man with a broken spine. Julian looked at the graph, then at me. His eyes were hard, devoid of understanding. He didn't see a safety warning. He saw a delay. He saw interest payments piling up. He saw his grand opening slipping away. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension, and told me that I was being dramatic. He said I was stuck in the past, obsessed with over-engineering. He claimed that modern materials could handle the load, and that I needed to stop thinking like a mechanic and start thinking like a partner in his vision. Before I could respond, Sienna chimed in. She didn't even look up from her screen. She said the marble was non-negotiable because it was the centerpiece of her neoclassical revival theme. Then, with a swipe of her finger, she cast a new rendering onto the main wall monitor. The image that appeared made my blood run cold. It was the grand ballroom on the top floor. In the original blueprints, the ones I had stamped and approved, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows were bisected by thick, X-shaped steel bars. Those were the cross-bracing. They were the muscles that held the building rigid against the famous Chicago wind. In Sienna's rendering, they were gone. The windows were uninterrupted sheets of glass, offering a seamless, panoramic view of the skyline. I stood up slowly, feeling a wave of nausea. I asked her, very carefully, if this was just an artistic concept. She smiled, a bright, vacuous smile, and told me she had already issued the change order to the steel fabricators. She said the X-bars looked like a prison and ruined the aesthetic flow. She had replaced them with structural glass, which she claimed was the latest trend in Dubai. I lost my composure for a fraction of a second. I slammed my hand on the table. I told them that this wasn't Dubai, this was Chicago. We have wind loads here that can snap skyscrapers in half. I explained that structural glass is strong in compression, but useless in tension. Without the steel cross-bracing, the building would lose its lateral stability. The first winter gale would twist the tower like a wet towel. And when a rectangular frame twists, glass doesn't bend, it explodes. I looked Julian in the eye and told him that if he proceeded with this, he wasn't building a hotel, he was building a glass coffin. The room went silent. The investors looked nervous. Julian's face turned a shade of red that matched the warning lights on my tablet. He didn't like being contradicted, especially not by a woman in work boots, and especially not in front of the money. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, and delivered the sentence that would seal his fate. He told me that my negativity was a cancer to the project. He said he needed solutions, not problems. He announced that effective immediately, the engineering department would report directly to Sienna to streamline the decision-making process. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a new contract. It offered me a role as external consultant, a position with no veto power, no authority, just a title to keep the insurance company happy. He was asking me to sell my integrity for a paycheck. I looked at the contract. I looked at Sienna, who was now smirking, victorious. I looked at the rendering of the beautiful, deadly room. I realized then that I couldn't save them. You cannot save someone who believes gravity is an opinion. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I reached into my pocket, took out my site access badge, and placed it on top of the contract. I told Julian that I would not sign. I told him I was resigning, effective immediately, and that I would be filing a report with the city, noting my objection to the structural changes. Julian laughed. He said he would bury my report, and that I would never work in this town again. He told me to clear out. I walked back to my office to pack. The vibration in the floor felt like a ticking clock now. I put my few personal items into a box, my favorite drafting scale, a photo of my father, a hard hat that had seen 10 years of sights. But there was one thing I left behind. On the corner of my desk, under the glare of the lamp, I placed the master maintenance logbook. It was a thick, battered black binder, containing 2 years of handwritten notes. It held the manual override codes for the basement hydraulic dampeners, the shock absorbers that kept the building steady. It held the torque specifications for the main truss bolts that needed tightening every time the temperature dropped below zero. It was the instruction manual for the building's survival. I didn't hide it. I left it right there, knowing Sienna would likely use it as a coaster for her coffee, too arrogant to realize it held the keys to the kingdom. On my way out, I ran into Elias Vane, the site foreman. Elias was 60, with hands like sandpaper and eyes that had seen too many accidents. He looked at my box, then at the elevator, and his face crumbled. He grabbed my arm and whispered, asking if the rumors were true. Were they really removing the cross-bracing? I looked him in the eye and nodded. I saw the fear in his face. He was 2 years away from a union pension. He couldn't afford to quit, but he knew what was coming. I told him to be careful. I told him to stay away from the windows on windy days and to document every order Sienna gave him in writing. "Don't be a hero, Elias," I said. "Just survive." I walked out of the plaza and onto the sidewalk. The wind hit me instantly. The hawk, the biting Chicago wind that cuts through coats and skin. For the first time in years, I didn't fight it. I let it push me. I hailed a cab and looked back at the building one last time. It rose into the gray sky, majestic and doomed. A beautiful lie wrapped in steel. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had done my job. I had warned them. Now, the only thing left to do was wait for the laws of physics to collect their debt. The first week of my unemployment was a surreal mix of calm and anxiety. I sat in my apartment, drinking tea, watching the leaves swirl outside my window, but my mind was still on the site. I found myself checking the weather apps obsessively, tracking barometric pressure drops. I knew that a low-pressure system was moving down from Canada, a classic November witch storm that would bring sustained winds of 40 miles per hour, with gusts up to 60. Every time the wind rattled my own window frames, I flinched, imagining the groan of the steel at the plaza. My phone remained silent for 3 days. And then the texts from Elias started coming. They were short, covert messages sent from the bathroom or during smoke breaks. They took the braces down on 30 and 31 today, he wrote. The building is swaying. I can feel it in my knees. Another text came 2 days later. Glass pane on 40 cracked during installation. Sienna blamed the glazier. She ordered them to force it into the frame. I stared at the screen. You don't force glass. If you force it, you are preloading it with stress. It becomes a bomb waiting for a trigger. I didn't reply to Elias. I couldn't. Any advice I gave could be construed as consulting, and if I consulted, I became liable. I had to let him handle it. I had to let them fail. Then the emails started. Although Julian had revoked my administrative access, he had been too lazy or too incompetent to wipe my email from the automated alert system of the building management software. I started receiving system-generated warnings. Alert. Hydraulic dampener 4. Pressure critical. Alert. Tilt sensor axis Z. Exceeding tolerance. The building was crying out for help. The hydraulic system needed a manual reset. A simple procedure outlined on page 42 of the logbook I had left behind. But no one was resetting it. The emails piled up in my inbox like unread letters from a dying relative. I created a folder named Evidence and routed them all there. I didn't delete a single one. The timeline for the grand opening was accelerated. Julian was hemorrhaging money and needed the cash flow from the launch event. They were skipping the final safety inspections, relying on paid-off city officials to rubber stamp the occupancy permits. I saw the ads on social media. The Thorn legacy, defying gravity. The irony was so thick I could taste it. They were selling the very thing that was about to kill them. Sienna was posting videos of herself in the lobby, talking about bringing light and air into the space. Behind her, in the video, I could see the velvet drapes hanging heavy on the walls. I knew why they were there. They were hiding the sheer cracks in the plaster. The building was shifting, tearing its own skin, and they were covering the wounds with fabric. The day of the launch arrived, November 12th. The forecast was brutal. A gale warning was in effect for the entire Cook County area. The wind was howling through the streets, tearing umbrellas from hands and knocking over trash cans. I sat in my living room, my laptop open to the event's live stream. I had a cup of tea in my hand, and the surface of the liquid was perfectly still. My apartment building was old, squat, and ugly, but it was solid. It had bones. On the screen, the Thorn Plaza looked spectacular. The cameras panned over the glittering crowd in the grand ballroom on the top floor. Men in tuxedos, women in silk gowns, all laughing, drinking champagne, oblivious to the fact that they were standing inside a structure that was currently being tortured. I turned up the volume. Underneath the jazz band, underneath the chatter, I could hear it. A low, mournful moaning sound. It was the wind whistling through the microscopic gaps in the facade, playing the building like a giant flute. I watched Julian take the stage. He looked manic. He was sweating profusely, gripping the podium as if it were a life raft. He began his speech, shouting over the noise of the wind outside. "We have built a monument to the future," he bellowed. As he spoke, the camera shook. It wasn't a subtle vibration anymore. It was a lurch. The entire room shifted inches to the left, then swung back. I saw a waiter stumble. I saw the liquid in the wine glasses slosh violently. The guests stopped laughing. They looked around, confused. This wasn't the gentle sway of a skyscraper. This was the jerky, unstable motion of a structure with no core rigidity. Then I saw Sienna. She was standing near the window, her face pale. She was looking at the massive, seamless sheet of glass that replaced the cross bracing. The glass was bowing inward. It was flexing under the wind load, turning concave. She took a step back. She knew, in that moment, the arrogance vanished, replaced by the primal fear of a child who realizes the monster in the closet is real. I leaned forward, whispering to the screen, "Get away from the window." And then it happened. It didn't start with a crash. It started with a pop, a loud, sharp sound like a gunshot echoing through the ballroom. A primary bolt on the ceiling truss had sheared off. The sound was followed by a screech of tearing metal that made my skin crawl. The crowd screamed. The ceiling above the stage dropped 6 inches as the support gave way. Dust and debris rained down on Julian's expensive suit. But the worst was yet to come. The building, twisting beyond its elastic limit, transferred all that torque into the rigid glass facade. The massive window pane behind Julian, the one that gave the panoramic view, didn't just crack. It exploded. Thousands of shards of tempered glass erupted inward, followed instantly by the roar of the gale. The wind rushed into the vacuum, blowing tables over, tearing decorations from the walls, and turning the ballroom into a wind tunnel. The live stream feed cut to static, then switched to a chaotic handheld view. People were stampeding toward the exits. The elevators would be down, the guide rails would have warped, so they would have to use the stairs. 40 flights of stairs in a building that was groaning and swaying like a ship in a hurricane. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding, not with excitement, but with a deep, heavy sadness. I picked up my phone. I knew it was about to ring, and I knew exactly who it would be. The phone buzzed. Julian Thorne. I stared at the name. I let it ring. 1, 2, 3, 4. I finally picked it up. Rowan! His voice was a high-pitched shriek, barely audible over the chaos in the background. The windows. The ceiling. It's all coming down. You have to help me. Tell me what to do. I took a sip of my tea. I can't help you, Julian. I'm just a consultant. Remember? Stop it. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Just tell me how to stabilize it. The fire department is 20 minutes out. You can't stabilize it, Julian, I said, my voice calm, the voice of the translator reading the final sentence of the book. You cut the muscles out of the body. Now you just have to hope the bones hold long enough for everyone to get out. There has to be a switch. A dampener. Something, he begged. There is, I said softly. It's in the basement. The manual override. The code is in the black logbook. What logbook? He screamed. The one on Sienna's desk, I replied. The one she's probably using as a coaster right now. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the cold, hard weight of gravity. I turned back to the window and watched the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles racing toward the plaza. The building hadn't collapsed. Not yet. But the Thorne legacy had turned to dust the moment they thought they were smarter than the wind. I placed my phone face down on the cool granite surface of the kitchen island, the screen finally dark, severing the last electronic tether between me and the disaster unfolding 3 miles away. The silence in my apartment was absolute. A stark, heavy contrast to the cacophony I knew was currently consuming the Thorne Legacy Plaza. I did not turn the television back on. I did not log into the news sites to watch the inevitable loops of destruction. I did not need to see the news helicopters circling like vultures or the shaky smartphone footage flooding social media to know exactly what was happening inside the skeleton of that building. I could feel it in my own bones. A phantom ache of empathy for the steel that was currently being twisted beyond its yield point, screaming in a frequency only engineers and dogs could hear. I poured the remainder of my cold tea into the stainless steel sink and watched it swirl down the drain. A small, controlled vortex that obeyed the laws of physics perfectly. That is the ultimate comfort of engineering. The rules never change because of someone's ego, budget, or timeline. If you remove the support, the structure fails. It is not personal. It is not malicious. It is simply inevitable. I walked into my bedroom and lay down, staring at the ceiling of my own apartment, tracing the lines where the beams met the drywall. I went to bed not because I was physically tired, my adrenaline was still spiking, but because there was nothing left for me to do. The time for calculations, warnings, and interventions had passed. Now was the time for consequences, and gravity is a debt collector that always clears the account. I closed my eyes, but sleep was a distant concept. Instead, I lay there listening to the wind outside, knowing that for the first time in months, it wasn't my enemy. It was my witness. The next morning broke with a deceptive, eerie calm. The storm had passed over Lake Michigan during the night, leaving behind a sky that was a bruised, heavy purple, hanging low over the city like a bruise. I woke up to a notification on my laptop. Not from Julian, but from the City Department of Buildings. The subject line was succinct, a death sentence in bureaucratic font. Emergency suspension of occupancy permit, Thorne Legacy Plaza. I finally allowed myself to open the news sites. The high-resolution images were worse than I had imagined during my sleepless night. The building was still standing. Julian had been lucky in that regard. The main core hadn't snapped, but it looked like a war zone. The wind, rushing in through the shattered panoramic window, had created a violent pressure vortex inside the ballroom. It had ripped the fire suppression system from the ceiling, flooding the upper floors with thousands of gallons of water. The water had cascaded down the elevator shafts, shorting out the electrical spine of the tower and pooling in the lobby where the expensive marble had cracked under the hydrostatic pressure. The most striking image, the one that would appear on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, showed the expensive velvet curtains, the ones Sienna had used to hide the structural cracks hanging in sodden, heavy rags outside the broken windows. They flapped lazily in the morning breeze like flags of surrender, a public admission that the cosmetic layer had failed to hold the structure together. The headline read, "Luxury opening turns into nightmare, negligence suspected." I drank my coffee and waited. I knew the corporate process intimately. First comes the shock, then comes the scramble for survival, and finally, the assignment of blame. Julian was not the type of man to go down quietly or with dignity. He would look for a scapegoat, and I was the obvious target. The disgruntled former employee. The woman who walked away. By noon, the first legal summons arrived. It was delivered by a private courier who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick, cream-colored envelope. It was a notice of deposition. Julian's legal team was moving with desperate speed, trying to frame the narrative before the independent forensic engineers could release their official report. They were going to claim that the structural failure was due to pre-existing conditions and maintenance failures ignored by the previous engineering team. Me. It was a predictable, if pathetic, strategy. They wanted to bury me under a mountain of paperwork, discovery requests, and legal fees before the truth could surface. I read the document calmly. It accused me of dereliction of duty, professional malpractice, and failure to adequately maintain safety sensors during my tenure. Reading the accusations, I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold focus of a surgeon preparing to cut. I didn't call a lawyer immediately. I didn't panic. Instead, I opened my laptop and navigated to the encrypted cloud server where I kept my personal backups, my digital shield. I opened the folder labeled Thorn Plaza, Correspondence. Inside were hundreds of files, meticulously organized. Every email I had sent, warning about the dangers of removing the cross-bracing. Every report detailing the load limits of the foundation. The rejection letters from Julian, signed with his flamboyant signature. The dismissive memos from Sienna regarding aesthetic interference. And, most importantly, the timestamp log from the day I left, showing exactly when I had updated the maintenance manual and where I had left it. I printed everything. 3 copies, one for my lawyer, one for the insurance investigators, and one for the city inspector. I was not going to fight Julian with words or emotion. I was going to fight him with data, the one language he had never bothered to learn. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a conference room in a high-rise downtown, facing a battery of attorneys representing the Thorn Development Group. The room was sterile, smelling of lemon polish and aggressive cologne, the air conditioning set to a temperature designed to make witnesses uncomfortable. Julian was not there. He was likely hiding in his penthouse, trying to salvage what was left of his reputation with his bankers. Instead, Sienna sat in the corner. She looked smaller than I remembered. Stripped of her designer armor, the arrogance that had defined her presence in the construction meetings was gone, replaced by a hollow, shell-shocked expression. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hands clutching a cup of water that shook slightly every time she lifted it to her lips. She stared at the polished mahogany table, refusing to meet my gaze, looking like a ghost haunting her own deposition. The lead attorney, a man named Mr. Sterling, no relation to the building, just a coincidence of expensive billing, slid a high-gloss photo across the table. It was a picture of the flooded basement, specifically focusing on the hydraulic dampener control panel. "Miss Kincaid," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, and accusatory. This system was offline during the storm. The dampeners were locked in a static position. As the lead engineer, was it not your responsibility to ensure these safety mechanisms were active and responsive to weather conditions? I looked at the photo. The panel was dark, the LEDs dead. It was my responsibility, I answered evenly, keeping my hands folded on the table until October 24th. That was the day I was terminated. From that moment on, I had no legal authority to enter the building, let alone access the secure control systems in the sub-basement. Doing so would have been criminal trespassing and likely industrial espionage. "But you knew the code," Sterling pressed, leaning forward, trying to invade my personal space. "You knew the storm was coming. You knew the dampeners needed manual resetting during the break-in period. You didn't think to call?" To warn your former colleagues that the building was vulnerable? Or did you stay silent because you wanted to see them fail? I warned the CEO and the project director explicitly, I said, glancing at Sienna. She flinched as if I had thrown a stone. I warned them in writing that the removal of the cross-bracing would increase torsional stress to critical levels. I warned them that the dampeners needed manual resetting every 24 hours. I left a detailed, handwritten logbook with these specific instructions on the project director's desk before I walked out of the building. Sterling smiled, a shark smelling blood in the water. This was the moment he had been waiting for. We have searched the project director's office thoroughly, Miss Kincaid. We have inventoried every item. There is no such logbook. We believe, and we intend to prove, that you took it with you to sabotage the transition, effectively crippling the new management team. You stole the safety manual, didn't you? I paused. This was their play. They had destroyed the evidence, or so they thought. They believed that because the book was gone physically, the record of its existence was gone too. I reached into my bag, a simple leather tote, not a briefcase, and pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a plastic sleeve. It was a photograph taken by Elias Vane, the foreman. He had sent it to me the day after I left. A simple, sentimental picture of the office to show me how empty and soulless it looked without my charts on the wall. But in the corner of the frame, clear as day, was the black leather binder sitting on Sienna's desk, buried under a stack of fashion magazines and fabric swatches. The metadata and timestamp on the digital file were undeniable. October 27th, 3 days after my departure. This photo was taken on October 27th, I said, sliding it across the table toward the court reporter and the city inspector, who was observing the deposition with keen interest. The logbook is clearly visible on the desk. If it is missing now, that is a question for the person occupying that office, not for the person who was escorted out by security. All eyes turned to Sienna. She stopped breathing for a second. Her face turned a shade of pale that made her look physically ill. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Sterling looked at the photo, then at his client, his confidence evaporating instantly. He realized he had been lied to by his own clients. "Miss Thorne?" he asked, his voice losing its theatrical edge, becoming dangerously quiet. "Is that the logbook?" Sienna looked down at her hands, her knuckles white. She looked at the picture, then at me, then at the city inspector who was already taking notes. Her voice cracked, a dry, brittle sound. "I thought it was just old paperwork. I might have moved it." "Moved it where, Miss Thorne?" the city inspector asked sharply, leaning forward. "That logbook is a federal safety document. Its destruction is a felony." Sienna closed her eyes, and a single tear escaped. "I threw it out," she whispered, the confession hanging in the air like smoke. "It was ugly. It was old and dirty, and it didn't match the aesthetic of the office. I didn't open it. I just put it in the recycling bin because I didn't think it mattered." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush concrete. The attorney, Mr. Sterling, closed his folder with a soft thud. He knew the deposition was over. He knew his client had just admitted to destroying vital safety records because they weren't aesthetically pleasing. He knew that aesthetic preference is not a legal defense for gross negligence. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I felt no rush of victory. Only a profound, exhausted sadness for the waste of it all. I organized my papers, stood up, and waited for them to dismiss me. The fallout was swift, brutal, and fueled by the relentless machinery of the insurance industry. The insurance investigators did not care about Julian's vision, his family legacy, or Sienna's design degree. They cared about liability and the bottom line. Once the transcript of the deposition was released, along with my documented warnings about the cross-bracing, the insurance company declared the policy void due to gross negligence and willful misconduct. This meant Julian was personally liable for the millions of dollars in damages, the lawsuits from the injured guests, and the cost of the emergency response. The bank foreclosed on the Thorne Legacy Plaza within the week, seizing the asset before Julian could even attempt to restructure his debt. But the tragedy wasn't just financial. The forensic engineering report came out a month later, and it was devastating reading for anyone in the industry. The report detailed how the removal of the steel bracing had allowed the building to twist so violently that the main structural rivets had sheared. The building hadn't fallen, but the steel skeleton had been warped permanently. It was plastically deformed, meaning it would never return to its original shape. To fix it, they would have to strip the building down to the foundation and start over. It was a dead building, a zombie structure standing in the middle of Chicago, too dangerous to occupy and too expensive to fix. I watched the news from my new office. I had been hired by a firm that specialized in forensic engineering and disaster prevention, a job that paid double my previous salary. My experience with the Thorn disaster, ironically, had made me one of the most sought-after consultants in the city. Clients wanted the engineer who had said no. They wanted the person who understood that physics doesn't negotiate. I spent my days analyzing other people's mistakes, ensuring that their buildings wouldn't suffer the same fate. One afternoon, 6 months later, I received a call from the front desk. There was someone waiting for me in the lobby. I went downstairs to find Sienna standing near the security gates. She looked different. The expensive Italian clothes and the manicured persona were gone, replaced by simple, functional attire jeans and a heavy coat. She looked tired, older than her 25 years, but her eyes were clear. She held a cardboard box in her hands. "Can I help you, Sienna?" I asked, keeping a respectful distance. I wasn't angry with her anymore. She was just another casualty of her uncle's hubris, a child given the keys to a Ferrari she didn't know how to drive. She didn't look me in the eye immediately. She looked at the floor, then at the busy lobby around us, listening to the hum of a functional, safe building. "I found this," she said, her voice quiet. It wasn't recycled. The cleaning crew put it in a storage closet because they thought it looked important. "I found it when we were clearing out the office for the bank seizure." She handed me the box. Inside was the black logbook. It was dusty, coffee-stained, and the corners were bent, but it was intact. The manual I had written to save the building had survived the building itself. "I don't need this anymore," I said gently, touching the cover. "The building is condemned, Sienna. It's over." "I know," she said. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I just wanted you to have it. And I wanted you to know that. I didn't do it on purpose. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I thought I could make it beautiful. I thought the engineering was just the boring part that got in the way of the art." "You did make it beautiful," I replied, offering her a small kindness, "but you forgot that beauty has to stand on something. You can't hang a masterpiece on a crumbling wall. The bones have to come before the skin." She nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. "My uncle, Julian. He lost everything. The house, the cars, the company. He blames you, you know. He says you should have tried harder to stop us. He says you let him fail." "I know he does," I said. "It's easier to blame the person who warned you than to admit you drove the car off the cliff yourself." Julian never understood that I wasn't fighting him. I was fighting gravity for him. Sienna looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time. "I'm going back to school," she said. "Not for design. For architecture. Real architecture. I want to learn how the load paths work. I want to learn the math before I try to choose the curtains again." I smiled. A genuine smile this time. "Good luck, Sienna. It's a hard program. The math is unforgiving." "I think I've learned that the hard way," she said. She turned and walked out of the revolving doors, disappearing into the Chicago crowd. I watched her go, feeling a sense of closure that no court verdict could have provided. She had learned the lesson that Julian never would: respect the structure. I took the logbook back up to my office. I didn't throw it away. I placed it on my bookshelf, right next to my engineering degree. It was a reminder, a monument to the invisible work that keeps the world standing. A year later, the demolition of the Thorn Legacy Plaza began. It was a slow, painstaking process. They couldn't just blow it up because of the density of the surrounding neighborhood. They had to take it apart piece by piece, reversing the construction process, unmaking the mistake. I went to the site one last time to watch. It was a cold, clear day, the kind of Chicago day where the wind bites at your cheeks and makes your eyes water. I stood behind the chain-link fence, watching a massive crane lower a steel beam to the ground. It was one of the beams I had calculated the load for, 20 years ago. It was twisted now, warped like a piece of taffy by the forces it had been subjected to during that one night of torture. Elias Vane was there too, wearing a consultant's vest, directing the crew. He had technically retired, but the demolition company had hired him to help them understand the skeleton he had helped build. He saw me and walked over to the fence. He looked older, his walk a little slower, but he looked peaceful. The stress of the Thorn project had lifted from his shoulders. "Sad to see her go down," Elias said, looking up at the shrinking tower. It is, I agreed. It was a good building, Elias. It had good bones, it just had bad owners. You hear about Julian? He asked, leaning against the fence. I shook my head. I try not to. He's suing the glass manufacturer now. Elias chuckled, shaking his head. Says the glass was defective. Says it should have held. He's spending his last dime trying to prove he was right. Some people don't learn, I said. They spend their whole lives trying to rewrite reality to fit their ego. They never understand that reality always wins in the end. He can sue the glass, he can sue the wind, but he can't sue the math. Elias looked at me, squinting in the sunlight. You doing okay, Rowan? You happy where you are? I am, I said. And I meant it. I'm working on a bridge project now. Nothing glamorous. Just pure, functional steel. Lots of cross-bracing. It's going to carry commuters safely for the next 100 years, and no one will ever know my name. Elias laughed, a warm, rasping sound. Cross-bracing is good. Cross-bracing keeps you upright. It does, I said. I stayed until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the demolition site. The building was almost gone now, just a stump of concrete and rebar sticking out of the ground like a broken tooth. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around my boots. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, sharp air. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the fear I had felt in that conference room. The anger of being dismissed, the anxiety of waiting for the disaster to strike. I realized that all of those feelings were necessary. They were the stress tests of my own character. I had refused to bend. I had refused to compromise on the truth, even when it cost me my livelihood, and because of that, I was still standing. The world is full of people like Julian and Sienna, people who want the shortcut, the flash, the immediate gratification. They build their castles on sand, draped in velvet, and wonder why they sink. But the world also relies on people like me. The people who read the manuals. The people who check the bolts. The people who understand that a structure is only as strong as its weakest connection. We are the ones who hold up the ceiling, while everyone else is looking at the chandelier. We are the ones who make sure the ground is solid before anyone starts dancing. I turned away from the ruins of the Thorn Legacy Plaza and walked toward the train station. I had a bridge to build, and this time, I was going to make sure it stood for a century. A silent, sturdy testament to the fact that doing things the right way is the only legacy that actually lasts. As I walked, I felt the pavement under my feet. Solid, unmoving, supported by layers of engineering that thousands of people walked over every day without noticing. That was fine by me. I didn't need them to notice. I just needed them to be safe. That was the job, and I was finally free to do it. Sometimes, the loudest sound isn't the crash, but the silence of the person who saw it coming. My story proves that you don't always need to fight to win. Sometimes, you just need to step back and let gravity do the rest. Real value doesn't need to shout to be heard, it just needs to stand firm when the storm hits. If you have ever been the invisible force holding a crumbling system together, know that walking away is not a weakness. It is often the only way to reclaim your worth. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the truth.